Chapter 2. Food Safety Plan Overview for Preventive Controls for Human Food. Alright, welcome back. In this module you will learn the benefits of using a food safety plan, the principles applied to build a food safety plan, a roadmap for building a food safety plan. The food safety plan is the primary document that guides your preventive controls food safety system. The food safety plan is developed using a systematic approach to identify those hazards that require preventive controls to prevent foodborne illness or injury. This chapter provides an overview of the components of a food safety plan that are needed to comply with the preventive controls for human food regulation. The principles applied to build a food safety plan. This module also provides a few examples of outbreaks and recalls that occurred when preventive controls that should be included in a food safety plan were lacking. Learning from past outbreaks and recalls can help protect consumers and your business from similar unfortunate incidents. As discussed in Chapter 1, the requirements in the preventive controls for human food regulation are based on well-established food safety principles. This chapter also provides a brief discussion of the systematic process involved in building a food safety plan. While this chapter provides an overview to help you visualize how you might structure a food safety plan specific to your operation, the details are covered in chapters later in the course. Don't forget the importance of understanding all the terminology. Let's take a look at a couple definitions. Food safety plan. A set of written documents that is based on food safety principles, incorporates hazard analysis, preventive controls, supply chain programs, and a recall plan, and delineates the procedures to be followed for monitoring, corrective actions, and verification. Adapted from 21 CFR 117.126. Food Safety System. The outcome of implementing the food safety plan and its supporting elements. So your goal is to build a system. Let's take a look at the contents of a food safety plan. Required. A written hazard analysis is the first required element in a food safety plan. When the hazard analysis process identifies hazards requiring a preventive control, the written preventive controls portion of the plan must address relevant process preventive controls, food allergen preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, supply chain, or other preventive controls. These are the preventive controls needed to control the hazards identified in the hazard analysis as requiring a preventive control. Monitoring, corrective action, and verification procedures for each of the preventive controls identified must also be included in your plan as appropriate to ensure the effectiveness of the controls. A recall plan is also a required element of a food safety plan when a hazard requiring a preventive control is identified. You are also required to maintain implementation records to document that you have implemented your food safety plan. Because your food safety plan will be used or reviewed by regulators, employees, auditors, customers, and potentially consultants, it may also be useful to include a brief description of your facility or company along with a list of your food safety team members, a product description, a process flow diagram, and a process description to help people understand the structure of the plan. This course includes these optional elements in the food safety plan example to help class participants visualize the hypothetical operation and resulting documentation examples. The remainder of the course goes into more detail on the elements of an effective food safety plan. Perhaps you may be wondering what's in it for me when you consider what it will take to develop your food safety plan. There are numerous outbreak and recall examples that illustrate the need for controls to prevent illness, as well as the benefit of having an effective and operational plan to avoid being involved in an outbreak or recall. Here are a few examples. Peanut butter is typically a safe product because effective roasting of peanuts can destroy potential pathogens, such as salmonella. However, an extensive outbreak in the U.S. associated with commercially used peanut products illustrates the importance of process validation, sanitation controls, and supplier controls. The outbreak investigation found that the peanut roasting process had not been validated, so it was not known how effective this control measure was. Further, salmonella was found in the processing environment, which suggests the environment was a potential source of product recontamination and that sanitation controls were not adequate. The incident involved hundreds of companies that had used the peanut ingredients in their products without an additional kill step. A supply chain program, including determining that any pathogen kill step has been validated and that the supplier has controls to prevent recontamination, is another important preventive control to include in a robust food safety system. Together, these preventive controls could have prevented or minimized the size of this incident and associated recalls. Another example involves a botulism outbreak that occurred in England in 1989. The manufacturer of the hazelnut conserve ingredient for the yogurt used a process that was similar to that used for fruit products. Because fruits have a lower pH than hazelnuts, the process was not adequate to kill C. botulinum spores, and the formula was not adequate to control growth of C. botulinum when the ingredient was held at room temperature. Process validation or storage of the ingredient at refrigeration temperatures may have prevented the issue. Understanding supplier capabilities is another important lesson from this outbreak. The hazelnut conserve manufacturer did not understand that their new product required more stringent controls. An appropriate supply chain program could have identified this shortcoming and addressed the issue before the yogurt manufacturer used the hazelnut conserve that had been inadequately processed. Avoiding or minimizing the potential for a recall is another benefit of having a robust food safety plan. Allergen recalls are responsible for at least a third of food safety recalls for FDA-regulated food products. See additional reading at the end of the chapter. The root cause for most of these recalls is not declaring the presence of the food allergen on the label. Chapter 10, Food Allergen Preventive Controls, provides more information on how to control this food safety hazard. Contamination of food products typically arises from three distinct sources, each posing unique risks. Ingredients: the materials used in food production can introduce contaminants if not properly sourced, handled, or stored. Understanding the potential hazards associated with ingredients is crucial for effective risk management. Processing environment: the environment in which food is processed, including equipment and facilities, presents another avenue for contamination. Poor sanitation practices, inadequate maintenance of equipment, and cross-contamination can all contribute to food safety hazards. Human factors: people involved in food handling, preparation, and service can inadvertently introduce contaminants. Lack of hygiene, improper hand washing, and illness among food handlers are common factors that can compromise the safety of food products. These sources of contamination are further explored in detail in Chapter 4, focusing on biological food safety hazards, and Chapter 5, which delves into chemical, physical, and economically motivated hazards. Understanding the origins and characteristics of these hazards is essential for developing effective preventive controls and mitigating the risk of foodborne illnesses or injuries. Developing a food safety plan, including determining where preventive controls are needed, involves a systematic process based on science to help ensure the safety of the product. It starts with hazard analysis, covered in Chapter 8, which is intended to identify hazards requiring a preventive control, in other words, the ones that matter most for food safety. When these hazards are known, preventive controls that are essential to prevent the hazard from causing illness or injury are identified. As previously discussed, preventive controls may include process preventive controls, allergen preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, supply chain preventive controls, or other preventive controls that you determine are essential for your product. Once preventive controls are identified, you need to determine relevant parameters that define the conditions that must be met to effectively manage the hazard. Monitoring provides documentation that demonstrates these conditions are met. Corrective actions or corrections are predefined to enable swift action when things go wrong, thus preventing expansion of a food safety issue. When things go wrong, you also have to ask if it was because a hazard was overlooked, in which case you must adjust the hazard analysis, or if a preventive control was not properly identified or implemented. All of the above is recorded and verified to ensure the system is operating as intended and to provide a record for others, e.g., inspectors, auditors, management, to show that this is the case. Some elements of a preventive control system also require validation to demonstrate that the controls actually work. This activity may be less rigorous for some preventive controls than others. These differences will become more apparent as we go through the course. If you currently have a HACCP plan, it likely will be the part of your food safety plan that addresses hazard analysis and process preventive controls. See Chapters 8 and 9. The hazard analysis may need adjustments to identify allergen, sanitation, supply chain, and potentially other preventive controls in addition to those addressed in a traditional HACCP plan. Food safety plans are specific to a facility, with preventive controls specific to a food product and process. It is possible to group products that have the same hazards and controls in one food safety plan provided and differences are clearly identified. Some operations choose to organize food safety plans around unit operations and production, e.g., making a blend that is used in several products to reduce overlap or avoid inconsistency. The organization of your food safety plan is up to you. In defining the scope of the food safety plan, you should determine the specific products and processes that the food safety plan will address, define the part of the food chain to be considered, e.g., products sold to retail may have different considerations than those sold to food service, to manufacturers, or directly to the consumer, and address biological, chemical, including radiological, and physical hazards associated with the above. The scope of the food safety plan may be influenced by regulatory requirements or specific requirements instituted by a customer. The specific format of a food safety plan is not defined. Each facility can organize the required information in a manner that suits their systems, the needs of their employees, the needs of their customers, and the requirements of the regulation. The important thing is to have a plan that is easy to understand, implement, and manage, that it is kept up to date, and that it is organized and accessible for inspection. The following is an example of how a food safety plan might be set up, using a notebook. Note that there is no requirement that all components of a food safety plan even be in a notebook. We are just using this as a model. I like to say this format is flexible, but contents are not. This course is organized around building a food safety plan. In our example, we used the 5 main sections or tabs for the food safety plan, including background information, hazard analysis, preventive controls, recall plan, and implementation records. The information behind the background information tab is covered in Chapter 6, Preliminary Steps in Developing a Food Safety Plan. Background information is not required by regulations, but provides a useful framework for organizing the food safety plan and for explaining the plan to others. Anything included as part of the plan may be subject to regulatory access and review. A brief description of the facility or company may be included. Listing members of the food safety team, along with required records on training, could be included in this section. 2 types of training are required by the regulation. 1. Food hygiene and food safety training, as appropriate to an individual's duties, and 2. Training, if applicable, for a preventive controls qualified individual. The product description section helps people understand important elements of the product that may impact food safety. An accurate flow diagram is useful to ensure that all steps of the process are evaluated to identify food safety hazards, and it serves as a useful organization format for the required written food safety plan. Finally, the process description could provide information needed to fully understand how the product is made. This can be helpful to those who are looking at the plan to understand, for example, the types of preventive controls applied. A facility can use other documents to meet these goals, if that works for their system. The hazard analysis drives decision-making on which hazards requiring a preventive control. Thus, the hazard analysis forms the basis for other required elements in the plan. Careful analysis of the hazards that may be relevant for your product will help you to focus the controls on what matters most. See Chapter 8, Hazard Analysis and Preventive Control Determination. Make sure you get this right. The Preventive Controls section describes the essential controls that ensure safe product is produced. The required preventive controls for a specific product are determined through the hazard analysis process, which considers the nature of the preventive control and its role in your facility's food safety system. Process preventive controls are discussed in Chapter 9. Food allergen preventive controls are covered in Chapter 10, and sanitation preventive controls are discussed in Chapter 11. Supply chain preventive controls include supplier approval and verification activities for ingredients and raw materials that have hazards for which the control is applied by the supplier. These ingredients are identified through hazard analysis. Chapter 12, Supply Chain Program, discusses supplier-related activities. In some cases, there may be other controls used by a facility as part of their food safety system, such as transportation controls, which would also be included here. As you can see, we have a lot of work to do. A recall plan describes, ahead of time, what to do when something goes wrong and the product is in commerce. The format that you use can vary considerably. For example, you may want a totally separate recall plan notebook, but it would still be considered part of the food safety plan. The Implementation Procedures tab includes other information required to support your plan. This may include validation studies that demonstrate that the preventive controls you selected are actually effective in controlling the identified hazards. Procedures for and records of monitoring, corrective actions or corrections, and verification activities may also be required to demonstrate that the food safety system was operated as planned on an ongoing basis. Example forms could also be included in a food safety plan notebook. The actual required records could be in a separate notebook, a file cabinet, a computer, or whatever format works for your organization. In summary, the food safety plan is a written document that is specific to the facility. It must contain a hazard analysis and separate plans or programs that address process preventive controls, allergen preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, supply chain programs, and other preventive controls determined to be necessary through the hazard analysis process. It must also contain a recall plan for food where a hazard requiring a preventive control has been identified. There is no required format for these documents or for the food safety plan itself. Some facilities may combine different sections, some may separate them. There is no requirement that all parts of the food safety plan be located in one place. The important point is that the whole food safety plan is organized in a way that identifies hazards requiring a preventive control so that 1. The hazards are effectively managed, and 2. The facility has records that demonstrate these preventive controls are in place and being implemented. These documents should be organized and easily retrievable when needed, e.g., for inspections or audits. Each of the elements of a food safety plan is discussed in subsequent chapters, using examples from a hypothetical food operation. Congratulations on completing Chapter 2 now. It's essential to thoroughly review all the attachments provided and ensure you complete the required assignments. These additional materials and activities are integral to reinforcing your understanding of the concepts covered in the chapter and preparing you for future modules. Stay proactive and engaged as you progress through the course. Keep up the excellent work.